Hi, everyone. This is Tony Nash with Complete Intelligence. Thanks for joining us for another quick hit. This is part two of our discussion of inflation with Nick Glinsman and Sam Rines. Part one really covered a lot around specific commodity inflation and why it's happening. In part two, we start looking into things like raw materials costs versus processing bottlenecks and manufacturing bottlenecks. It's really interesting. We then get into wage inflation and labor availability and how long these impacts will last. And finally, we start talking about central banks. What will the Fed do? Will it do anything? When will it do it? Those sorts of things. So sit back and enjoy it. This is a really fun discussion. When you're finished, appreciate if you could like the recording and subscribe. Thanks very much. What the people in the middle, so the manufacturers, what capacity do they have to absorb these price rises? What are you guys seeing when you talk to people, when you read? Are you seeing that manufacturers can absorb the lumber prices, the copper prices, and other things, or are they passing that directly along?
Sorry, Sam, I'm jumping in here. The beauty of that question right now is there was a major headline in the Financial Times talking about margin compression and how US corporates are going to be increasing prices. It was today. You had the likes of Chipotle. We'll go on to that. That's a labor cost issue. But the other, J&J, various bare necessity manufacturers for nappies, for kitchenware, all sorts of. They're seeing they're going to have to pass price pressure through to the consumer. And as we were discussing just before we started, you know, the elasticity of price increases is very high. The elasticity of price decreases is extremely low. And I would contend that this becomes a rolling snowball effect as these prices get passed through to the consumer. There are other costs that will be passed through too, which we can talk about later on the labor side. But there's clearly one of the signals that are well worth watching are the margins in the corporate reporting. And all of them are suggestive of higher prices to the consumer. Then you look at the ISM prices paid. I have a chart, a model that looks at that versus CPI. And if that model sticks to what it's done over the last couple of decades, it's indicative of CPI, actually, the big figure, getting up to somewhere around 4, maybe even higher.
Okay. So it's kind of a China 2011 scenario, 4 to 6% CPI.
Correct. Correct.
But in
And
the
I think also the process of decoupling, as long as it may be, that process has created a demand because of the supply shock. There's a supply shock in the system. The demand is adjusting there too. So that work is additional demand to fill in the supply gap. So if the decoupling replacement process is long-standing, the demand is still there. It's a matter of supply then catching up. There's a price disparity caused by that.
Yeah, we definitely have a mismatch, at least in the short term, right? And will those supply chains catch up? That's a real question. Sam, what's your view on that in terms of manufacturers being able to absorb these costs and margin pressures?
Yeah, so I'll jump to the housing market as my example, which I think is one of the more interesting ones because you filter right through down into lumber. Uh, Very close friend of mine in Houston is delaying the start of 190 homes that were supposed to be going into. Well, he has the pads laid. He won't build those homes until lumber prices go down. It's the largest backlog he's ever had, and that got us talking and kind of working through the market. And when you look at the market for pine studs in the U.S., it's an intriguing look into kind of where the cost pressures are coming through, where mills that make the 2x4s are making an absolute fortune off of the disruption. But if you own a pine stand of several thousand acres, the tree that you are cutting off of it is the exact same price as it was a year ago. You have
Oh,
seen none of
really?
the you have seen none of the price increase at
So
all.
there's not a raw material supply issue. It's a processed material
Yes,
supply issue.
exactly. So it's the supply chain breaking down, right? You didn't have the mills up and running for a couple of months. You had about 40% of the capacity offline, and that created a shock to the system that will eventually, will be sorted out at some point. We didn't destroy any capacity. For 2x4s, we're building, even at the current rate, we're building 1.7 million homes. That's nowhere near what we were doing in 2005, and yet lumber is 4 times where it was. So
So
again, yeah,
may I ask a question? Because you're obviously in touch with that level on a micro basis. So one of the things that I've been told by several different sources is they don't disagree with you on lumber calming down eventually. The problem the home builders now have is labor shortage.
that might be a problem in the Northeast. That might be a problem in a kind of the coastal problem in the U.S., where I have fewer contacts in construction. But in the South, there's no labor shortage. Wages are still very strong. You have some projects that were delayed for large oil, which created a supply of able-bodied plumbers and electricians where there's a shortage elsewhere. So I would say that's probably very true for parts of the country. There's anecdotally Bath Iron Works, one of the major uh, boat build docks in the northeast, is driving around an RV trying to recruit people to come, trying to recruit welders. That was a problem before
Yeah,
COVID. And it will remain a problem. The trades will be a big issue. Common labor, particularly in the South, does not appear to be an issue. But that is an issue in the North.
okay. I've heard it's an issue in Florida actually as well, which is back to your point about coasts.
We're
Sorry,
in
I
Texas,
interrupt.
Nick. It's the
What's that?
promised
Sorry.
land. We're in Texas. It's the promised land. I
You
mean,
and I,
doesn't get much better, right?
would agree with you on that one, right?
Okay, so we've gone long. I know these are very detailed issues, but I'm going to ask another question. I did ask for some questions over Twitter. So one of them came in from Brent. This was around supply chain disruptions, which we've already talked about. There's another from Jarrett Heath. He says, will it be velocity or magnitude that causes the Fed to react to inflationary pressures? So, what do you guys think? Are we going to see kind of the magnitude of inflation push the Fed to react, or what's going to push the Fed to react to start to taper a little bit, if they do at all?
I would say both at the same time. My great fear is that there is, and this was actually covered by the Wall Street Journal, but I've written and spoken about this as well. I sit there looking at the Fed becoming reactive rather than proactive, and the great punch bowl analogy is gone. And that worries me enormously because they have great confidence in something that they're forecasting as transitory, and we know what their forecast record is. And if you really want a bad forecast record, just go over to Frankfurt and see what the ECB is all about. Now, it's interesting to me that the conventional wisdom, the consensus forecast has brought forward tapering to the end of this year, as opposed to next year. It seems like the more people talk about the inflation pressure, the greater it is. But I wonder whether we will get tapering. That's what worries me about the Fed. I've been really working hard on looking at what Claudia Sahm has written and said over the last couple of weeks. She wrote an op-ed in the New York Times, an op-ed in Bloomberg. She's an ex-economist for the FOMC, the Board of Governors, actually. And you get the feeling that the priorities are unemployment with equity, racial equity, as opposed to equality. Furthermore, you get the feeling that financial stabilities, both of those more important than inflation. Now, if that's the case and we start to see any signs of a taper tantrum, I worry that this Fed is going to do a proactive, either stop the idea of tapering or do a twist or something that further eases this market. I think they've got themselves, we have a very political Fed that is, if it's reactive by nature, it could be pro-cyclical by action. And that's where I really worry about it. Then, we've got Powell's term expiry February. Well, Lael Brainard is one of Janet Yellen's favorite people. And if she gets in, we're going full MMT. So those are my concerns about the tapering, this focus on financial stability, and the risk that reactive policy will be pro-cyclical.
Interesting.
Yeah.
Okay, that's great, Nick. Thank you. Sam, help me understand, what's your point of view on this? What gets the Fed to react, and how do they react?
So I would go with neither of those will get the Fed to react. It's not a question of should they or what we think they should do, but it's a question of will they, and they won't react to inflation. They do not care magnitude. They do not care about the velocity, and they won't care for at least another 9 months because we know the combination that they're going to look through the combination of base effects and supply chain disruptions at least through the end of the third quarter. They do not care, and then they will start the clock on their 4 quarters of inflation above or at 2%, and they want full employment before they raise. That's 4% at least on measured unemployment. So I would say whatever you want to look at for inflation numbers, they don't care, and maybe they should, but they don't. So I will say
care yet, or they don't care, period?
they don't care, period, until it's been a year of around 2%, and this summer and fall don't matter to them.
Or let me add one, or it's too late.
Yes.
I'm with you, and I seem to agree. I mean, that is exactly the impression I got from Claudia Sahm's words. I mean, it was just straight up, and that's where I worry. I have a huge respect for Lael Brainard. She is a very, very accomplished economist, but she'll go full MMT. It's what Janet Yellen wants. It's what the Democrats want, and I really worry about that. Plus, combine this with, here we go back to Larry Summers. You combine this with this fiscal effort, and one thing so in American terminology, progressive policies typically have historically been inflationary. In English terminology, which is what I am, these socialist policies have a history of inflation. More government intervention, more pushing against a string and inefficient allocation of resources, labor restrictions, minimum wage, universal basic income, it all leads to in one direction. So I agree with you, Sam. I think this Fed doesn't care. And I think That's hence the reactive. When they react, it's going to be, in my view, potentially too late. It's already started.
So I just sent out on Twitter a chart that Sam published about 3 weeks ago from another source on the negative impact of fiscal stimulus. And as we end up 21, like in Q3, Q4 of 21, that fiscal stimulus starts to have a negative impact. And certainly in 22, the US fiscal stimulus has a negative impact. So, there are a number of things to worry about, not just with inflation, but with the efficacy of some of this fiscal stimulus that's going into the market. So, with that, I want to thank both of you guys. Honestly, we could talk about this for hours. I would love to have this discussion with you guys again, even in a couple weeks to talk about other issues. So let's see where this goes. But thank you so much. Thank you very much for your time on this. I really appreciate it. We'll get this out as quickly as possible. Thanks to everyone who's watching this. Thanks for everyone who submitted questions. For those who did submit questions, for the questions we used, we'll give you guys a month of CI Futures, and look forward to the next time. Thanks for joining us.